Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Phanish Puranam. I'm the Rollenberger Professor of Strategy and Organization Design at INSEAD. And it's my great privilege to host today's discussion on OrgTech, how technology is changing the work of management. I have two amazing speakers along with me who I'll introduce in detail in a second. Let me just briefly go over a few points on webinar etiquette and the history of this seminar series. We're very grateful to Accenture for supporting this series where we discuss the latest research and the latest ideas, both from the world of research and practice, on technology and how it's changing organizations and management. Let me say a bit more about my wonderful co-panelists here. So it's a rare privilege to have not just co-authors, but also alumni of INSEAD PhD program, who I had the privilege of working with. So we have Piyush Gulati, who is Assistant Professor of Management at the UCL School of Management, and Arianna Marchetti, who's the Assistant Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Singapore Management University. I have been working with them for many, many years now. And today we are really excited to share some really cutting edge work that literally has appeared in journals in the last year, 2 years at most. So it's a fairly academically oriented talk today because we're going to talk you through some concepts, some results, but hopefully we also want to make sure that we can convey why we think these results and ideas are so important for practice. This is really the overall theme of our talk today, which is how technology is changing the work of management. Not changing work in general, but the work of management and organizing in particular, which is why we call today's session OrgTech. I'm going to flip to my slides so you can see what we're going to be talking about today. So the lens we're trying to propose today is a slightly different one from the usual. And our plan is to walk you through the logic behind it, some of the early results we are seeing, which are really exciting, very recent work. We'll also talk about papers from other colleagues, not just from us, because we think these are all quite connected once we apply this lens of OrgTech. We'll aim to talk for about 30-35 minutes and leave plenty of time for us to have a discussion anchored by your questions. So we will kind of try to address your questions, but also, I guess, talk among ourselves a little bit to see how we can understand these ideas. The usual question that we've been asking when technology arrives on the scene, any new technology, not just AI, is which tasks will machines automate? And that is indeed an important question because it has direct impact for jobs, for labor market outcomes, for wages. But there's perhaps a better question for us as management professionals to ask, which is how does technology change the way we organize? So how a machine does a task is not the same thing as how a machine affects the way we organize collections of tasks and how they interact together. So this more aggregate question is what we're talking about when we refer to OrgTech. Here are the main points from today's talk. If you recall nothing else by the end of it, we hope these points will land. First, we want to distinguish technologies for production and say these are different from technologies for organizing. So if you think about technology as one big lump, I don't think it's helpful. So there are technologies that are directly involved in production. They convert inputs into outputs. But there are also technologies which shape the way we organize production, how we do division of labor, how do we do integration of effort among different actors who are doing the production. Within OrgTech, we also think it's very helpful to distinguish vertical and lateral forms of OrgTech. Vertical OrgTech is about increasing the productivity of managers who exercise authority. That's why we call it vertical. And lateral OrgTech refers to increasing productivity of peer-to-peer collaboration among people in the organization. Lateral OrgTech, which is a technology or any technology that makes it possible for people to do more peer-to-peer collaboration without needing to be organized by a manager, almost intuitively reduces demand for managers. Vertical OrgTech, which is the technology that improves the productivity of what managers do using authority, might increase or decrease the demand for managers. And this depends entirely on whether the demand for what managers do increases as they become productive or not. So that's a mouthful. So we're going to talk about each of these ideas in more detail with examples. But the general high-level point to take away is OrgTech is different from production technology. OrgTech comes in vertical and lateral flavors, whereas lateral flavors clearly reduce the demand for managers. Vertical OrgTech may or may not. And it depends very much on context, which we'll explain in some detail. Notice I haven't said anything about AI so far, because everything I've said so far applies to any OrgTech. AI can play a very important role as an OrgTech, but it's also, of course, a production technology. And as an OrgTech, it can play both lateral and vertical roles, which is one of the reasons why the question, how will AI change management, is just too crude. It's not a question that one can answer with any precision because we have to specify, is it the production channel or the organization channel? Is it the lateral or the vertical channel? Without answering those, we can't really have a precise answer to the question, how does AI change organizations? So what does OrgTech mean? And more fundamental to that, what does organizing even mean? So we've been working on a framework now for more than a decade on this idea of the universal problems of organizing. So in this framework, an organization is just any group with a goal. That's it. So a department could be an organization, a team could be an organization, a sports team could be an organization, a company is one, so is an ecosystem, so is a government. And notice in the way I've drawn this picture, the agents in the organization don't have to be human. So some could be human, some could be AI, but as long as it's a group with a goal, it's an organization. And what we call the universal problems of organizing are a set of problems to which it is necessary and sufficient to have solutions for this organization to exist. So we can prove this. And the necessary part of it comes from the fact that by definition, if it's a group with a goal, then we must have ways in which we can do task division, convert the goals of the group into tasks, task allocation, allocating those tasks to people. And since those agents will need to be motivated and will need to be coordinated, we need to provide rewards, we need to provide information. And since none of the answers to these four questions are ever perfect or permanent, there will be exceptions. So we need systems to manage those exceptions. So this basic set of 5 problems are what we call the UPOs, or the universal problems of organizing. Broadly speaking, there are 2 ways in which we can solve these UPOs. There is the lateral approach, which is people can just reach answers to these 5 questions. Who does what? Who gets what? Who talks to whom? And what do we do when exceptions arise? You can do this consensually, right? That would be the lateral way of doing it. And often small groups do it exactly like that. So even startups, when they begin, tend to work mostly laterally. The problem is consensus doesn't scale. As the number of people in a group increases, the potential for conflict between them increases superlinearly. It's more than linear. It can be quadratic, it can be even higher. So it's definitely not linear. And that's because of the way interactions explode as the number of people in the group increase, which is why we also need vertical capacity to solve these problems through the managerial authority hierarchy. So broadly speaking, the way we solve these UPOs can be laterally or can be vertically. And in general, there are exceptions. In general, as we scale the size of the organization, there are limits to lateral solution to these problems. You have to rely on vertical. And in addition, what this picture also shows is because any individual manager has a finite span of control, as groups scale further, you also need to add layers of middle managers. So this combination of constraints on scale to consensus and constraint on span of control together produce the multi-layered authority hierarchy that we all know and probably love or maybe hate. But that is basically the structure of how modern organizations look. Now, one interesting relationship between these lateral and vertical forms of solving the UPOs is that all else being equal, more of one means we need less of the other to attain the same level of problem solving. So think of these as 2 different mechanisms to produce the same outcome. And if you have a lot of power in one, you don't need the other. So if you're very good at peer-to-peer dispute resolution, why do we need managers? If you have excellent managers, then we can even bring a set of people who don't know each other and have never worked together, and still an excellent manager can pull them together. So these are what we call functional equivalents. You might be reaching for the word substitute, but I would ask you to hold on. This is not the same thing. At this point, all we want to say is the more you have of one, the less you need of the other to obtain the same level of capacity for problem solving. So I want to first illustrate this idea by referring to a project that Arianna and I worked on for many years. This has nothing to do with technology. So it illustrates the basic logic of what I've said in a non-technological context. But it's going to be the valuable building block into which we can then introduce what technology does when it takes on a role in solving the UPOs either laterally or vertically. Arianna, would you please walk us through our paper?
Sure, happy to. Anish, I will tell you when to move to the next slide. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is a project that Phanish and I recently published on Strategic Management Journal, and I think it's a good illustration of how people can work together in organizations, and in a sense, what are alternatives to traditional hierarchical firms. So the specific question we are addressing here is whether firms that appear to be less hierarchical are organized around stronger cultures. And let me first clarify what we mean by stronger cultures. A strong culture is one whose members are strongly aligned on what they believe are the few attributes of the culture that they all consider important. And the idea here is that really a strong culture can be an alternative that allows people to laterally organize by themselves and achieve as a form of functional equivalence to a hierarchical firm. The main contribution we bring with this paper is not only addressing this important question to show how people can collaborate and cooperate and coordinate within firms, but also bringing this perspective of evidence from big data. So Panish, if you go to the next slide, I can show what I mean with this big data. We leverage two massive data sets. The first is Glassdoor, which I believe most of you know as a website related to labor markets where people can do many things, including going online and review the firm they work for. So they write things that they like and dislike. And we use these reviews that employees can share about their firms to measure organizational culture. So we pull all the reviews that people working in a certain firm have written over time for that firm, and we apply some natural language processing in the form of machine learning to understand how aligned people are in defining what they like and care for about the culture of their firm. And then we combine this data set with employee social profiles from LinkedIn that are aggregated by a data provider called Revelio. We have like more than 40 million profiles of employees, and we use this to classify employees of the firms in our sample into managers and subordinates. And this is our proxy of a hierarchical firm. We want to understand what the ratio of managers to the total size of the firm is, which is what we call managerial intensity. When we put these two massive data sets together, we get to a sample of more than about 23,000 firms, all based in the US, that span over 11 industries. And this is the biggest sample that has ever been used to look at this relationship between hierarchy and culture. So we're, first of all, very proud of the empirical approach we take here, but I think what comes next is also quite interesting, is we can document the relationship between the hierarchical aspects of the firm and the culture. So what I'm going to very briefly show you here is that we can report systematically over this very large sample of firms that there is indeed a negative association, very strong, between the strength of the culture of a firm and whether it relies on a high degree of managerial intensity. The association is negative, so firms that have stronger cultures seem to rely on less managerially intensive forms of organizing. So they need less managers for the total size of the firm. If we take two comparable firms of 100 employees each, a first one with 30 managers and the second one with 50 managers, we see that the first one, so the one with less managerial intensity, would need a culture that is roughly 5% stronger to achieve the same integration of effort. So what we're showing here is that these two ways of organizing, through a tall hierarchy, through a lot of managers, and with a strong cultures, are alternative forms of achieving coordination and cooperations of people in the firm. Now, the question we also have in the paper, and we go after that with quite a lot of empirical sophistication in a sense, is trying to understand why this is happening. And we have two main explanations in mind. The first one is what Panish started the talk with, the idea of functional equivalence. Culture and hierarchy can be two alternative ways of organizing people to achieve the same outcome, which is coordination and cooperation. But there is also an alternative that, in a sense, we want to understand whether it's a stake or not. It can be the case that when you have a lot of managers, what we call a highly hierarchical firm, the managerial structure breaks down the organizational membership into small subgroups, each of which is affiliated with a manager, therefore weakening the culture. Because when you have all these subgroups, everybody's organized into smaller silos, it's harder to have a shared organizational level culture. So we do quite a lot of empirical investigation, which I'm not going to go into details today but to try to understand which of these two mechanisms is at stake. And in this paper, we find really strong support for the first, but not for the second mechanism. So we can conclude that a strong culture and a managerial intensive way of organizing are functionally equivalent for firms to get people to coordinate and cooperate effectively. So I think this is a very nice illustration of what Phanish was meaning about vertical versus lateral ways of organizing people and how they can be functionally equivalent. So now I would pass it back to him to draw some conclusions and introducing the idea of OrgTech.
Thank you, Arianna. So now that we have some clarity on what we mean by technology for organizing, because it's driven by the universal problems of organizing, the fact that there are these vertical and lateral ways of solving the same universal problems of organizing, let's drill down a bit on what exactly technology can do in this space. So I'm going to introduce the concept of OrgTech, which we define as algorithmic technologies that change the supply of lateral and or vertical capacity for solving the universal problems of organizing. So notice it's not changing the demand for solving these problems, it's changing the supply, which means it offers new alternative ways of doing what managers would have done vertically or what people would have done peer-to-peer laterally when they have to solve these problems of organizing, which are universal, right? They recur at every scale, from small groups to large groups. And very concretely, we're thinking about tools for allocating work, coordinating teams, tracking performance, shaping incentives, routing information, resolving exceptions. Notice these are not technologies of production. So this is not a robot on a manufacturing line that makes a widget. This is something like a Gen AI tool or even a traditional work management software, which is helping people to coordinate better, not directly playing a role in the output that they produce. That's what makes OrgTech different from production technology. So we will get to AI, but we think it's really important to do it step by step. So hopefully this concept is very clear and how it differs from production technology, the vertical and the lateral aspects it can take on, all of these are clear. Let's now take the next step and look at a real technology, an OrgTech, which works in a very, very precise way that one can track in the data. This is the project that Piyush led for us. So Piyush, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Phanish. Hello, everyone. This is the paper that Phanish, Arianna, and I worked on for a couple of years and recently published in Management Science. The title of the paper is Collaborative Work Management Technologies and Managerial Intensity in US Corporations. So the question broadly that we look at in this paper is, what is the impact of OrgTech adoption on organizational structure? So Phanish, if you go to the next slide. So as Phanish was describing, OrgTech can do either of the two things. It can either provide vertical capacity for solving universal problems of organizing, or it can provide lateral capacity for solving universal problems of organizing. However, there is an interesting implication here that irrespective of which method through which OrgTech provides this capacity for solving universal problems of organizing, if the demand for such problems is fixed, then in either case, the number of managers per employees that are needed in the organization would go down. So let's say, for example, we take these vertical capacity enhancing organizational technologies. Let's say we give managers an app to supervise, to monitor, and track employee performance. When we give such a technology to a manager, the number of employees that they can supervise and look after would be much higher than without a technology. You would notice that in such case, the need for managers would go down, which we think of as flatter organizations. But the level of centralization in an organization hasn't really changed. Managers are still making the decisions that they were making before the technology. It's just that fewer managers are able to make that decision making done. Instead, on the other side, if you think of technologies that are providing lateral capacity, they are making individuals observe each other's work, give feedback on each other's work, to coordinate tasks, and then work collaboratively overall in a team. In such a scenario as well, the number of managers in a team would go down. But importantly, this is associated with higher decentralization simply because individuals in a team who are at the same level are able to provide each other feedback. So there is some decision making and some power that is taken from the managers and given to the employees. So again, the number of managers would go down, but with a higher decentralization in an organization. So the idea is that OrgTech can reduce the number of managers, but one comes with higher centralization, which is a vertical capacity enhancing technology. The other comes with higher decentralization, which is the lateral capacity enhancing technology. And that's the theoretical premise that we explore further in this paper. And we do this by specifically studying the adoption of collaborative work management technologies. So the specific tools that we look for adoption is tools called as Jira, Clarizen, and Smartsheet. And most of you would know what these tools are. So these tools were originally developed for project management for software development, but now these are used for project management all across non-software work as well. The key attribute of these tools is that they help in information aggregation within a team or within an organization in a way that everyone within the organization can view that information. As a result of which, what it enables is as a workflow management, knowledge sharing, and collaboration in a team where everyone in the team can work together. So for people who don't know what these tools are, the way at least we explain it to the reviewers in our paper is that think of these as tools that provide like a board for project management plus a Google Doc. So everyone in the team can see what everyone's doing, and they can also collaborate on tasks together. So given that these are tools that have been designed for collaboration, what they allow us is a clean, they allow us to make a clean hypothesis, a clean proposition that after adoption of these tools, there would be more lateral capacity for organizing in the organization than vertical capacity for organizing. That's the proposition that we test in this paper. And then we use an approach that's very similar to what Arianna and Phanish use in their paper. So we look at two mega large data sets. We don't use Glassdoor, but we use Revelio Labs. That's a data set that provides the social profiles. And what we do is we look at profiles of people in the US. And then we look at who are the managers and who are the non-managers in a company. And we identify what's the managerial intensity in an organization. And we merge it with another data set, which is coming from an aggregator called Lightcast. So what Lightcast has done is they have access to all job postings for companies in the US. From 2010, they have it for other countries as well. But for this particular study, we focus on public firms in the US only. And we look at the text of these job postings to identify signals of use of these CWM tools that we were talking about in the previous slide. So we look at if they use Jira, they use Clarizen or Smartsheet. Then we also use the text of these job postings to identify signals for lateral collaboration. So we create two dictionaries. One is delegation, which is people can self-manage and do their work independently. And then another dictionary for collaboration with each other, which is more focused on teamwork, communication, and presentation. And overall, we create this data set by merging it with CompuStat, which gives us financial and employee information for these companies as well. Combined, this gives us 10 years of data for 3,000 public firms in the US. There's about 27 million job ads, and we use about half the employee profiles of what Arianna was describing when she was talking about the Revelio Labs data. If you go to the next slide, so if you look at these are like our main findings. So if you look at this plot on the left side of your screen, the way to read this is t is equal to 0 is where the technology gets adopted. And the x-axis therefore is 4 years before to 4 years after adoption of these CWM tools. And what the y-axis gives you is it's the relative change in managerial intensity from the base year, adjusting for changes in non-adopting companies as well. So what we find is that before the adoption of these technologies, the managerial intensity remains almost constant. But after these, immediately after, like t is equal to 1, you see that there is a significant drop in managerial intensity, on average about 3.2% in adopting public firms to the US. But as we were discussing, this in itself doesn't tell us whether these are lateral capacity enhancing organizations or vertical capacity enhancing organizing technologies. We need something more. So therefore, we look at job postings data, and we look at these keyword dictionaries as well. And we find that there is about 5.2% increase in the delegation keywords in non-managerial job postings. And there is about 7.2% increase in lateral collaboration skills. Combined, what this gives us is evidence for reduced need for managers, but by more lateral capacity enhancement in the organization, overall giving us a signal that there is more decentralization in organizations after adoption of these technologies. So yeah, back to you, Phanish.
Thank you. So let's take the next step, which is now move towards what are the early studies telling us about the impact of AI as an OrgTech? And here I'm going to flag two recent papers. None of them are from our team, but we read each other's papers and learn from them. So there's a new paper which has come up from colleagues at ESA and led by Alexieva et al. And what they find is artificial intelligence adoption increases the demand for managerial expertise. And this is a very interesting finding. And the reason they find this, by the way, is they're not looking at Gen AI, they're looking at predictive AI. So this was prior to the Gen AI revolution. And of course, predictive AI is not only an org tech, it's also a production technology. So what's happening is the demand for solving the universal problems of organizing is rising, as well as the capacity, and therefore also the increase in managerial capacity is co-occurring with that. So there's a very nice paper which came out very recently from them, which is pointing out that all AI are not the same. So if you ask the question, is AI going to increase or decrease demand for managers? It's a poorly specified question. So one must be precise in asking which particular kind of AI we're talking about. In their case, it's predictive AI. There's also a very recent paper which is forthcoming shortly, I think in management science, by my colleagues and friends, Matteo De Vigili, Erdem Ilmaz, Vibha Gaba, and Henry Grepp. This is also an INSEAD team. And they've been looking at the impact of Gen AI now as an org tech, not as a production technology. So this is very close in spirit to what we're talking about. And they also code the impact of Gen AI on the demand for managerial capacity for actually solving those 5 universal problems of organizing. What they find is that the demand for managerial capacity for some of these UPOs falls, not for the others. So for certain things like task allocation, task division, and information provision, the technology proves to be an adequate substitute for what managers used to do. So the demand for managerial skills actually goes down. This is the first recent study, I think, which has actually applied this way of thinking about universal problems of organizing to the specific question of what AI is doing to what managers are doing. And I think it's very consistent with the overall framework that we showed you. Now, we want to generalize this a little bit more. And the generalization here is that while algorithms can increase vertical or lateral capacity, we've already exposed you to this idea, it is important to bear in mind that contexts differ a little bit in whether the demand for these solutions is inelastic or elastic. Okay, that's a technical term that comes from economics, which basically says as the productivity of what managers do goes up through these technologies, is what they're doing considered more valuable or as valuable or no change at all, right? Or even perhaps less valuable. And the reason for that is just ask yourself the following question. If you write really good advertising copy, but it takes you, let's say, $100 to produce a nice piece of advertising copy, if the technology allows you to produce it at $50, will you sell more copy or will the demand for copy remain constant? That's basically the elasticity question. And applied to managers, what I think we're seeing is that in these large organizations, in stable organizations where the processes are pretty much stable, the demand for what managers do might be quite inelastic. So making it cheaper by making managers productive doesn't increase demand for what they do. And that's why we see these effects where these technologies actually lower the demand for managers. But you could also imagine other contexts where when you make what managers do cheaper by making them more productive, the demand for what they want actually goes up. And in fact, you might end up seeing a need to buy and hire more managerial expertise. So in a context like startup scaling, for instance, you might see exactly the opposite, where the adoption of these technologies makes managers more productive. That's common to both columns. But in this case, where in fact the demand for what they're doing is increasing because of the productivity enhancement, you might see a greater demand for managers. And the same team that did the very nice paper on Gen AI and the UPO problem solving also has some early research where they find signs of this, where Gen AI adoption seems to be increasing managerial intensity in the startup context, as opposed to the large company context like the one that Piyush and I were studying. Now, in this entire discussion, we've been assuming implicitly that the effect of AI technologies or any technology is as a productivity enhancer, particularly when we're talking about vertical capacity. If the question is, what do these technologies of org tech do to managers? We've kind of assumed the impact is productivity enhancement. But we well know from the past research, that's not the only possibility. One has at least 2 other possibilities to account for. Could the technology just act as an outright displacer of what managers do? So it basically takes all the tasks that managers do and takes them off the table because no human is needed to perform them. And I think the answer, at least for management today, is definitely no. the effects are not likely to be task displacement. Why do we say that? I think it's helpful to realize that we're really talking about two different thresholds when we talk about the displacement of managers by technology. There is a technical threshold, and I've put a picture here of Alan Turing because everybody probably knows the Turing test. This is the idea that you have a curtain, you don't know what's behind the curtain. Is it a human? Is it a machine? You look at the output and you're supposed to guess. Okay. And in some sense, our framing has been this Turing framing that as long as in that blind test, the machine outperforms the human, we should adopt the machine. But this is not how humans work, and it's certainly not how humans work in the context of management. So that's why on the y-axis, I've put the picture of Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, whose big contribution is to help us think about legitimacy. So even in a world where the Turing test might be passed, behind the curtain, we don't know what it is. It's doing as well as a human or better. We remove the curtain. The question is, even if the machine does better, by knowing that it's a machine, does it make you more, less, or equally likely to still adopt it? And I think for a large class of managerial phenomena, the answer is pretty clear empirically that even if the quality were identical in a blind test, once you remove the blind, people prefer the human. You can call this prejudice, you can call this homophily, you can call this human nature, but it's a fact of life. In fact, the law also propagates this in the sense ultimate accountability and responsibility legally must lie with the human. So there are strong Weberian constraints, if you like, to what can or cannot be displaced. So with some colleagues also at UCL, Sunny Lee and others, we've run a survey to actually capture this. And what we found in a sample of close to 1,000 workers from the United States is that across these universal problems of organizing, the y-axis is telling you preference for AI-led decisions. Lower means less preference, higher means more preference. So notice nothing is above 40%. So on average, people still want humans to do these solutions to the universal problems of organizing. But among these problems, there are differences. In particular, people are okay with things like task allocation and information sharing being done algorithmically to a greater extent. But things like reward allocation and dispute resolution, it's pretty clear they don't want the algorithms to touch it. They want people to manage these things. So this is why we think it's highly unlikely that the framing for understanding the impact of OrgTech on managers is one of task displacement. It's probably more about productivity enhancement. But that, as we just showed you, could lead to an increase or a decrease in demand for managers, depending on these other conditions we walked you through. One last idea to think about is that there's a third effect of technology that we must account for. This task displacement, which we think is unlikely for managers, this productivity enhancement, which we've discussed at length, but there could also be task creation. There's been a big literature on what do managers do, starting from the 1970s. So I'm thinking of Henry Mintzberg's work. I've done some recent work in this domain with Amir Goldberg. But I think what we haven't thought enough about collectively is how the role of management might change to take on new tasks. Because task creation is one of the robust properties of new technologies. It always happens. New technologies displace some tasks, increase productivity at some tasks, but they also create new tasks, what Acemoglu and Otter call the task reinstatement effect. And I might wonder, what do these tasks mean in the context of management? What are new tasks that managers will be called upon to do in the age of AI that they weren't doing earlier? And I want to give you two candidate answers. By no means is the list complete. Traditionally, we've separated learning and development from management. But I don't see why this should necessarily be the case. It may well be the case that managers going forward play the role of teacher, a guru in the real sense, who are also training and inculcating the skills of their subordinates, not merely monitoring and coaching them. There's a difference between coaching and teaching. And I think increasingly the training might become one of the responsibilities of your direct line managers and not necessarily of the L&D function. It's a conjecture. I'm not saying I'm confident this is true. Another might be a new class of meta-organizational skills, where what you're doing is managing the coordination between humans and agents and constantly redefining that division of labor. So these are new tasks which would actually reinstate the demand for managers even as their productivity is going up. These are yet to be seen. The data are really not there, right? All the papers I've shown you today, by the way, have come out in the last 2 years. So this is really cutting edge. And we don't yet have the depth of data to answer the kind of questions I'm raising now, but it's something to keep in mind as we move forward. So in summary, I'm going to stop here and we switch to answering questions. The main points we want to make sure you take away is OrgTech is different from production technology. It's technology that increases our capacity to organize, and it can do this vertically or laterally. Lateral OrgTech reduces demand for managers. It's unambiguous. But vertical OrgTech may increase or decrease the demand for managers. What it does currently is increase productivity of managers. It doesn't do task displacement completely because of social acceptability. But that increase in managerial productivity can lead to fewer managers if there is no increase in demand for what they do. And this is the case, I think, very often in studies looking at large companies or in companies which have pretty completely automated production technology. In those cases, OrgTech, particularly vertical OrgTech, unambiguously points towards fewer managers. But it could lead to more managers in the opposite situation. So in growth situations, or by creating new managerial work, such as training. So the future of managers at this point is certainly in flux, but by no means looks like it is pointing towards extinction. Let's stop there. Thank you very much for listening. Let's perhaps open it up to questions and see what we can answer. So, Piyush and Arianna, did you notice interesting questions that you want to flag or some that you already answered, perhaps?
Yes, so I think Piyush and I already answered the fairly technical ones on the paper, but we have left a few open that I think touch upon like more fundamental issues. And I think there are a couple about the whole concept about like how technology is replacing the way we individually work rather than how we work together. So perhaps we can offer some clarification by what we mean in terms of organization design. The first one is maybe a fundamental question to ask before addressing the organization is, quotes, how does technology change the way we work individually and together? So I think here perhaps you can offer a clarification of what we mean exactly with the concepts we have been floating around.
Yeah. So how technology alters individual productivity is absolutely the starting point. So there's no doubt that's where we need to start. It just happens to be a domain which is not necessarily our primary area of research. So we draw on the work of our colleagues to understand the results from that domain, right? So how it changes individual skills, how it changes individual productivity. I think these are well studied. I've done a little bit of work myself in that domain, but I think this is in the world of org design, we take individuals and the impact on them as a primitive in our language. It's a starting point. But once you ask the question, how we work together, we are squarely in the world of organization design. So I want to make sure that we are very clear on this point. When Piyush and Arianna and I or any of my collaborators, when we talk about organization, please don't have in mind a Fortune 500 company only. We mean any group with a goal. And that could literally be a team of two people. For us, that's an organization. It could also be a 200,000 person company or a 2 million person company. These are all groups with goals. And the reason we are so broad in the way we think about organization is because we think we have discovered some universal problems of organizing, which are true whether the group is of size 2 or of size 2 million. And those universal problems are the 5 that I showed you: task division, task allocation, information provision, reward distribution, exception handling. So we've been focusing very much on the moment you go from 1 to 2, or 1 to 200, or 1 to 2000, you are in an organization, group with a goal, and then the universal problems that you are confronted with have to be solved. And those could be solved through managerial impact, or they could be solved through lateral collaboration. This is all very well known. All of this was true before AI, before any technology. It was true in our hunter-gatherer past, in fact. But now what the technology is doing is allowing us to add more capacity into the system to do vertical and lateral organizing along these dimensions.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another one about the why. So Pablo is asking, when you organize work, is it not important to know why? And I think it is, but I want to pick your brain on this.
Yeah, and please feel free to answer your own viewpoints as well, Piyush and Arianna. I assume you mean by the why, what is the goal of the organization? Right? This is how I'm going to interpret it. This is not an interactive platform, so I cannot kind of question you to make sure I understood. But please feel free to type in if you think we misinterpret your questions. So it is true that in organization design, the field, we tend to be agnostic to the goal. Our analysis usually begins with an assumption that there is a group and there is a goal. But where that goal comes from and whether it's the right goal or it is the right set of values that motivate it, as academics, we are specialists, we tend to compartmentalize that, right? But increasingly, I've come around to the view that that's probably not very healthy. We have to have a viewpoint on what is the goal of this organization. And in particular, the set of goals that I'm increasingly pushing for in a lot of my teaching and consulting, but also in my research, is to make the point that organizations are not just goal-oriented in the sense of getting to performance outcomes, they also have a second goal, which I define as human centricity. And by human centricity, I mean organizations are contexts in which people not just earn a living, but they also find meaning. We are a group living species, right? We're evolved to live and work in groups. We don't thrive in isolation. And organizations provide both of these functions in our societies. So they're very powerful tools that get things done that you can't do alone. That's one goal. But the other why for why they exist is they're also communities in which people find connection, meaning, and all sorts of social psychological properties, which makes organizations very important for us. So a lot of the work that my collaborators and I do today is to think about how we can deploy AI in organizations in a way that improves their goal centricity, improves profits, makes them efficient, makes them innovative, without sacrificing human centricity, while continuing to make them habitats in which people find meaning. And we have a very precise way of measuring this. If two companies offer the same salary, the same material compensation terms, and you pick one over the other, I think that non-monetary compensation is a signal of the human centricity of the second organization. And how to preserve that while deploying AI has become like a very big question for us. We also think there are good business reasons why you should do this as a CEO. The humanitarian reasons are obvious. I don't need to belabor them. But as long as contracts are incomplete, which means we can't fully specify what people should do, and intrinsic motivation is important because we can't monitor what people are doing, then human centricity is absolutely critical to competitive advantage, right? In this big AI movement, we shouldn't forget that the technology is rapidly becoming a commodity. All of us can access the same LLMs through APIs. So what would you differentiate on? It would be through human capital. And that's the reason the why question of why are we organizing has to include some account of keeping these organizations human-centric. So I used the opportunity to launch into my favorite rant. I'm not sure it was the one that Pablo had in mind, but if it wasn't, Pablo, please put in a question. Do you want to add anything? Piyush, Arianna, please feel free to do so.
No, I agree with this, and we have a fair number of questions. So
Okay,
I rather, yes.
Okay.
So
Can I say that?
Yes. Yeah,
Maybe
ahead,
like one question we can answer right now is like there is one question from an anonymous attendee saying that are these findings biased to like weird cultures? So I think my take, and like Phanish and Arianna, you can take as well. Like I think what we are hypothesizing in our theory is agnostic to any culture, like any form of teams as well. So we think they should not. But if you think that there is something specific about cultures outside the US where some of this would not generalize, we would be happy for you to note it down and then we can think about it.
Yes,
So
there is a
I would actually
specifically,
even
Panish, maybe to add on this, it's not just about the findings of our papers, but also one of the participants, Jason, is asking about the AI adoption and OrgTech more broadly, whether we expect adoption rates and behaviors between Europe, Asia, and the US being different. So my personal view is that the mechanisms we have been elucidating on how they work should be the same, but probably there are some differences in like a risk appetite and adoption rates that might actually not be the same across countries.
I think that's absolutely true. And even for our studies, right, both my paper with you, Arianna, and also the three of us together, the exact estimates we have, I don't think they would be the same if we were to run the study in Asia or in Europe, right? They would not be the same. I think we should accept that. But the directional effects, we don't see a reason why they wouldn't, because they are based on certain universal properties of human thinking and of organizations. They're called universal problems of organizing, right? They're not culture-specific problems of organizing. So I don't think the directional effects change, but empirically, we do see big differences in adoption processes and where it is adopted and the level of CEO enthusiasm for adoption for AI across different geographies. So I live and work in Asia, right? And it's a very different cultural context from Western Europe, which is, of course, again, very different from North America. And I can clearly see the differences between at least Western Europe and Asia, because I teach and consult in both. And you can see in Asia that the urgency and the need to adopt, because if we don't, the competition will, is driving a lot of behavior. So there's very rapid adoption. There's a lot of emphasis on efficiency. There is perhaps less concern about the impact on human centricity than there ought to be in some of the companies I work with. Whereas in Europe, I see, if anything, that the concern is maybe too strongly in the opposite direction. Neither, I think, are optimal. And the reason is both come from a place of limited information and fear. So these technologies are going to make some jobs redundant. I don't think there's any ambiguity about that in my mind. But they also open up the opportunity of creating a lot of new jobs. there can be a lot of task creation happening. And the enthusiasm with which that is being pursued in these two geographies is quite different. So I think there are these big differences, and partly our mission as educators is to try and bridge that gap of information and fear to make sure people can see all sides of this problem.
Thank you, Panish. I think we have another couple of questions that are specifically about whether we can say something about the level of management where we observe the results, so middle versus top management. I don't think in our papers we're able to say anything about that, but perhaps any reflection on whether we would see just the results to attenuate or some flipping or any other different mechanisms, I think will be interesting.
Piyush, did you have anything to contribute on that one?
So I think at least the way we were thinking when we were doing our paper, the three of us, is that these are like fractal organizations. And then if there is lateral capacity at the middle management layer, then the idea that the top management would be needed less holds true as well. So it's that the higher above you go, there is still some lateral collaboration, and then vertical and capacity is also needed, even if you don't consider the bottommost layer. So that's the idea. But I think given some of the other papers, like I think there is one more paper, and I can post a link, that there is a Liti and Zhang paper which says that it's more about middle managers themselves are doing more lateral collaboration, and so probably some of the mechanisms that we are talking about are more for the middle managers and not as much for the topmost managers who have to do other things in the organizations as well.
So I do also want to point out this important, it's kind of an obvious asymmetry. When I point it out, you might laugh that, it's so obvious, it's not worth pointing out. The fact is, at the top, there is a limit to how much you can substitute managers. You still need the CEO, right? That's just the way the law is set up around the world. You need human CEOs, full stop. So and the reason for that is not necessarily because humans are better CEOs, because you can send the humans to jail. You can't send the algorithm to jail. So because of accountability reasons, there is a limit to how much you can reduce human involvement at the top of the organization. So some of the effects we think, I would conjecture, will get progressively weaker the higher you climb in the hierarchy. Simply because of that constraint that at the top there must be a human and they must have a span of control. So these things cannot be easily dismissed. So therefore the effects probably get weaker. The other reason is a very pragmatic one. The people who have the power to make decisions about where to hire and not hire are the people on the top. So it's unlikely they will be voting for reducing their own numbers. So for both these reasons, I think there is probably a weakening of the effects we're talking about as we climb higher.
Another one on heterogeneity of results. Even though we have UPOs, so they're universals, can we say something about heterogeneity across industries? And, in our two papers, we explored that, and we see that depending on how works and functions are structured across industries, we see the results being stronger or weaker, but so in a sense, the effects are universal. They're just stronger or weaker across the different industries. But I don't know if you have, across your 20 years of work on this, seen anything different that you would like to add.
I think conceptually a very important point to clarify is they're called problems for a reason, right? These are universal problems of organizing, not solutions. And this is one of the reasons we actually built this framework, because some of the other org design frameworks that were out there, like the McKinsey 7S or the the star model of Jay Galbraith, these are great frameworks, by the way. I've used them myself in my teaching and consulting. But the problem is they tend to focus on bundles of solutions. Okay, and these bundles of solutions have very different impact in different industries. So that's why in some industries you might say the 7S doesn't seem to work as well. Here the star model works, here it doesn't. The universal problems of organizing makes a very strong, but I think defensible claim that it doesn't matter which industry you're in, which culture you're in, how big or small the organization is. The problems are universal. The solutions are not. Okay, so just to take a very stark example, think about Wikipedia versus the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the Encyclopedia Britannica example, I probably need to update because increasingly I think nobody in the room knows what I'm talking about. So this used to be how we collected knowledge before Wikipedia. Okay, so it does the same thing as Wikipedia, but in a completely different way. So they still have to solve task division, task allocation, information provision, rewards, exception handling, but it was done mostly through hierarchy and through humans. Wikipedia does it mostly through open source, collaborative lateral collaboration, and through algorithms. So that's the difference we see. The difference lies in solutions, not in the problems. So by construction, the problems don't change by industry or by level or by size. It's only the solutions.
Thank you, Panish. There are a couple about, of course, the elephant in the room, so specifically adoption of AI. And I think we might want to offer some clarification about, let me find it again, what the expectations are in terms of impact on collaboration, because I think there might be the perception that we know that Gen AI is going to help, but I'm not sure we have strong enough empirical evidence as of now. So I'm going to bundle a few points together. The first one is natural language made large-scale human coordination possible. Gen AI increases the bandwidth, reach, and plasticity of that coordination layer inside organizations. So this seems a pretty strong statement in favor of Gen AI, but I think it would be helpful to share with the audience our thinking about, well, we really don't know how things might pan out.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the entire talk today has been to say we may not be able to make precise estimates of, this will happen or that will happen, right? You can see there's so many contingencies, but we do think we know the underlying mechanisms pretty well. So what is unclear is the strength of the forces, but the forces and their nature is very well understood. I think there's nothing new that's going on with AI that didn't happen with the telegraph or with the steam engine for that matter in terms of organization design. It's just that the speed at which it's happening is fundamentally different. And the AI as a production technology, of course, also changes the way humans and machines interact at the individual level. So I don't know if I can say anything particularly more smart about that point.
Can I
Yeah,
just
go
say
ahead,
something?
Piyush.
No, so I think just to map like bandwidth, reach, and plasticity of coordination layer to what we have been talking about. So I think the way we have been thinking about is that either it helps increase capacity of an individual, and now in a coordination, that individual is a manager, or it increases information aggregation between team members. So I think those are two very clear ways of looking at what Gen AI can do as an OrgTech: increase capacity of one person to look at different people, or just increase the capacity of everyone to work together. So I think bandwidth, reach, and plasticity could probably be broken down into these two distinct properties that we see that they seem to be working in the technologies we study, and we conjecture that they work for Gen AI as OrgTech as well.
Yeah, this maps nicely into kind of our vertical lateral distinction, right? That's what seems to be picking up as well.
Can we say anything about perhaps the speed of change? There is a point about how should middle managers see AI for the next 10 years time span? Do we keep learning AI in depth and upgrading the usability skills? What's your thought considering long term? So it's a little bit current development versus long term speed of change, and is it just a matter of like keep upgrading our skills and the underlying problems and mechanisms kind of remain the same?
So I'm going to say something which might be a bit controversial, and I don't know if Piyush and Arianna will agree. So feel free to disavow yourself from this viewpoint. I do strongly believe that everything we've seen with these technologies and what we understand about org design, the need for the number of middle managers per employee in most companies will only in the net go down. Net of everything, right? So I'm not saying managers will disappear. You will need managers at the top. You'll need some middle managers too, but far fewer than we currently have per company. Now, this is not the same as saying middle managers as a profession will become smaller in number. That might happen. But if you have enough new companies starting, the net number of middle managers theoretically could remain the same. So I'm not saying middle managers are going extinct or as a species are declining, but I certainly think the average company will manage with fewer middle managers than it did in the past. Okay. It also means those fewer individuals need a different kind of skill set. Because for one thing, they would have got to that role not necessarily having come through many layers at the entry level, because entry level hiring is also shrinking. So partly they would have to be skilled at doing what they're doing in their context, not necessarily on the job, but through training that happens before they come to their organization. Second, and the obvious point, they'll be managing really mixed teams of humans and agents. So that's a skill set which I think is just beginning to emerge, and people are managing their own teams of agents, but this is going to become more and more, I think, the norm. I think this RNA company Moderna made news a couple of years ago when they actually merged the roles of the HRO and the CTO, saying it's all the same thing, right? It's just work. Some of it is done by human agents, some by technologies. So that might well be a precursor to the way we think about what middle managers ought to be doing. So in a traditional large company today that has many of them, I suspect they will have fewer of them. I don't know. Do you guys agree or do you have a different viewpoint?
No, yeah,
Sorry,
that's right. Yeah, sorry, Ariane, go ahead.
I was just busy thinking about, because there is another interesting question. We have been talking about a lot of managers, and it's like, you're saying the net effect, especially at the mid manager level, is going to be a decrease. But then one of the participants is rightfully observing that there are a lot of job losses at this point that are happening in the non-managerial roles.
Correct.
So, and in a sense, we're giving a hopeful message to the subordinates, which is OrgTech can empower you. You might get your work done in a more lateral way. You might need less managers in the firms, blah, blah, blah. But how do we put together these two forces of, is it just a transitional phase where we're seeing job losses and replacement and automation at the bottom of the hierarchy? What's the long term going to be? Should we actually be as hopeful as we are with our research about subordinates versus management?
So I just want to be very clear. Our research by itself offers no particular basis for hope in either direction. Okay, it basically says there are these structural forces, this is how they interact. The aggregate effect is not clear. What we know is that as you bring these technologies in, the role that managers perform, which is a substitute for peer-to-peer coordination, becomes less important. That's just a fact of it. What does it mean for average jobs, I think, is a different question. So here I want to perhaps draw not so much on our own research, but I think the best research in this comes from economics. They've been thinking about this problem for a long time. And their conjecture at this point is the aggregate effect of any technology on jobs is the net of three forces: the displacement of tasks, the increase in productivity of existing tasks, and the creation of new tasks. So whether AI is going to net create more jobs or take away more jobs is the sum of these three forces. And the point that I think we want to really emphasize is that this is not inevitable. It's not like some force of nature which we just have to adjust to. Task creation is a managerial, entrepreneurial, innovative activity. So if companies actually use AI to produce a lot of new ideas, a lot of new business processes, a lot of new products, lots of new services, it could well be that we actually see a net increase in jobs at all levels, right? I'm still going to stick to my point that that increase is compatible with a shrunk middle management layer. But the aggregate number of employees and even the aggregate across companies could actually go up. So this is why I think we can't reduce it to such simplistic questions about will there be a net increase or decrease in jobs. We have to take into account all these different channels which are operating at the same time. I see we're close to the end point, but I really want to channel an idea that I thought was really nice. So I was at a conference a couple of days ago where Eric Brynjolfsson was receiving an award at the London Business School. And he articulated very nicely something that I'd been thinking about, but not found a good way of saying it. He said, imagine that there are these concentric circles. Okay, the big circle is all possible things that can be done that are valuable. Within that, there is a smaller circle, what humans currently do. And what AI seems to be doing is to look within that smaller circle at an even smaller circle of what you can automate. Whereas what we ought to be doing is expanding the size of that circle. Right? How can we use these technologies to expand what could be done that is valuable, but we aren't doing? And if we take the direction of development in that direction, then in fact, net, there could be more jobs. So I'm not the only one saying this, by the way. Andrew Ng has been pushing the same point for the last year very strongly, that the job apocalypse is basically exaggerated. Yes, there is short-term disruption, but there could be net and impact. I don't know enough to know if he's right, but I think it's an optimistic message everybody needs to hear.
And I think this is a wrap.
Thank you, Arianna. Any last comments from either of you? I know I've been talking a lot. I hope I didn't crowd out your opportunities to say
No, we
something.
largely agree with your view. This is why we've been working together for so long.
That's what worries me. Piyush, anything to add?
No, that's it. And I know that there are other questions in the chat.
Yes.
In case there is a way we can send you answers, we will definitely try to.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you very much. Thanks for all everybody for being with us, and we hope to keep the conversation going. There are other excellent Tech Talk events coming soon, so please join us for those as well. Thank you.